Okay, just as a heads up, it should be noted that this video was filmed and recorded prior to the general election being called on the 22nd of May for the 4th of July, so this may impact some events that are still current. Anyway, enjoy the video.
There's many ways to describe UK elections. Brutal, fierce, exciting, hopeful, even gloomy for some. But one word that I think best describes most elections here in the UK is memorable. And why do I think they're memorable? Well, I think we can thank the coverage that the elections received. Coverage is notable for producing very interesting moments such as Portillo moments, emotional drama, and, if we're being honest, a wide variety of bad electoral takes. But the election night is not complete without one of the most crucial talking points prior to the results coming through. This, of course, being a poll that is basically why all the discussion of the coverage takes place originally. This, of course, being the exit poll. The exit poll has been a staple of all general elections since the 1992 election and is used to estimate what the results of the election will be on a seat-by-seat basis. Unlike opinion polling, which asks voters how they are intending to vote, the exit poll instead asks voters how they voted afterwards. This is generally carried out at polling stations across the UK, usually in key marginal seats, in order to identify the seats which would be expected to change hands. This can allow the exit poll to identify the changes in voting pattern and model this on a constituency basis with demographic information on where trends could be taking place. It's by no means perfect, and we'll see shortly of instances where the exit poll has been a bit inaccurate, to say the least. But it's overall been rather reliable and accurate on most occasions, which has allowed its reputation to be strong enough to become a major talking point for journalists, politicians, and even politically motivated civilians between polls closing and results coming through. Since the 2005 election, the exit poll has been conducted by a polling company called Ipsos Mori, one of the UK's oldest polling companies, on behalf of the BBC, ITV and Sky News, all of whom have utilised the exit poll findings in their respective coverages for each election. Now, under the Representation of People's Act 1983, the exit poll cannot legally be revealed prior to polls closing, as there is a potential that it could influence those who have yet to vote. So it's usually instead revealed the moment that the polls close at 10 o'clock on election day. In most of the earlier elections, the poll only revealed the Conservative, Labour and Lib Dem figures, although starting in 2015, this was expanded to include other parties across England, Scotland and Wales, including SNP, Plaid Cymru, the Greens, and then usually either UKIP or the Brexit Party, depending on the election. More to come for that when we discuss the 2015 election. Usually though, on these exit polls, the Northern Irish parties are not factored into the exit poll and are usually just classified as other. Normally, for example, when you look at later exit polls, you'll find others being on 18 or 19. Almost always, this will refer to the Northern Irish parties. Apologies for those in Northern Ireland, but I do not conduct the exit poll myself. And we're going to talk about how reliable most of these figures have been. Well, let's take a look, starting in 1992. So, beginning in 1992, it's fair to say that the exit poll did not get off to a great start. Polling leading up to 1992 had Labour marginally ahead of the Tories, with the expectation that Labour would either receive a narrow majority or a hung parliament would be achieved. And this latter option is exactly what the exit poll predicted. Unusually though for modern day exit poll, what the initial one did in 1992 was put together a range for the parties as opposed to nailing onto a single figure, which left the Tories and Labour both about neck and neck in terms of estimated seat share. Even despite the exit poll having a lot of leeway with the figures range, it was still unable to even remotely predict the eventual Conservative majority, which in the exit poll's defence was not expected at all according to opinion polling or political expectations for the election. If I think we want a good example of where the "oh god, this isn't going right" moment, I think perhaps the declaration of Basildon in Essex would be a good example. Basildon was a key Labour target at the time, and the party had failed to pick it up, which was enough to signal that John Major was going to unexpectedly return to power at the end of the election. Of course, in retrospect, the 1992 election is famously remembered for being the unexpected upset victory for the Tories, and it's been haunting Labour ever since. Although Labour's fortunes were about to improve quite dramatically at the following election, as the next exit poll will very much show. So, the 1997 general election, perhaps one of the most famous general elections I think out there, with records being made and the Tories losing out, I think, to put it mildly. Where were we? The exit poll. Okay, so 1997's exit poll was quite bold, I think, to say the least. It gave an extraordinarily large Labour figure, although despite this, the rough seat estimations were fairly spot on, all things considered. 97's exit poll had Labour on 410 seats, the Tories on 180, and the Lib Dems on 43, with other parties on 8, which discounted the Northern Irish parties. The seat forecast was actually rather spot on, as in reality Labour had 418, so 8 more than expected, Conservatives got 165, 15 less than expected, and the Lib Dems got 46, 3 more than expected. In a closer election, these changes in seats would look quite drastic, given that every seat counts at that level, although the scale of Labour's landslide and the Tories' heavy defeat was not really in doubt either way. Similar case also occurred in the 2001 election, where the exit poll once again perfectly predicted Labour's second landslide. Interestingly enough though, in 2001, the BBC and ITV's exit polls were quite different to one another, although both showing largely the same landscape, that being of course a second Labour landslide, but the actual figures themselves were quite different. The BBC had Labour on 408, the Tories on 177 and the Lib Dems on 44. ITV meanwhile had Labour on 417, Tories on 154, which was a worse figure than their 97 performance, and the Lib Dems on 58, which quite a big sharp increase. In reality, the final result was roughly halfway between the two. Labour at 413, which was 5 less than what they had in 1997. The Tories at 166, which was only 1 more than 97. And the Lib Dems were at 52. Starting in 2005, though, the BBC and ITV later worked together on a joint exit poll with Ipsos Mori, as well as NOP, who used to also assist with it at the time. So this brings us on to our first joint one in 2005, which gave Labour at 356 seats, Conservatives on 209, and the Lib Dems on 53. Now, 2005's exit poll was a lot lower than what was a lot of forecasts expected, although Labour still kept their majority, yet it was nowhere near as large as it was in the last 2 elections. But, despite the exit polls conflicting figures with opinion polls, the opinion polls were wrong and the exit poll was right. In fact, to be honest, it was almost next spot on actually. Labour's figure was predicted to be on 356 at the time of the election, and that is exactly what happened. The Conservative Lib Dem figures though were a fair bit higher and lower respectively in the exit poll. The Tories got 198 and the Lib Dems got 62, which is still their highest performance seat-wise in a general election so far. So 2005 was another success for the validity of the exit poll, and it was not even the last time it would exactly predict the winning party seat tally. This was also done as well in 2010, although the exit poll correctly predicted the winning Conservative seat tally this time at 307, a strong increase from 2005, but not enough for the party to secure a majority. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, Labour and the Lib Dems have both lost seats. Labour expecting to fall to 255 under the exit poll, and the Lib Dems to 59. Now, the loss of the seat for the Lib Dems was quite interesting, and it drew a lot of scepticism and criticism from many commentators, as the Lib Dems have been performing exceptionally strong in opinion polling leading up to the election, including a few polls which had them ahead. So, to see the Lib Dems not only fail to gain more seats, but actually go backwards on their 2005 performance, was considered quite surprising at the time. But, what do you know? The exit poll was correct. The Lib Dems did indeed lose fewer seats. In fact, actually, they lost even more than what the exit poll said they would, with the final Lib Dem tally being at 57 rather than 59. In Labour's case, they got 258, which was 3 more than what the exit poll said they would. Still, despite the loss of seat for the Lib Dems, still considered quite a successful election for them, all things considered. Unlike... So, the 2015 election. An election that, in my humble, and if we're being honest, quite useless opinion, I think is quite underrated among election geeks. It's generally not considered an election known to be a massive realignment compared to other elections, but results aside, It was an election where psephology was experimented with quite a bit at the time. 2015 seeing the rise of parties outside of the main three, such as UKIP and the SNP, the exit poll was this time calculated on a more individual constituency basis that hasn't really been seen before. So this caused a lot of very interesting figures within the 2015 exit poll, with the overall projection also including a lot of smaller parties for the first time, as I initially mentioned at the start. For the 2015 exit poll, this gave the Conservatives at 316, still short of an overall majority, Labour on 239, which was worse than even their 2010 performance, the SNP on a very staggering 58, which would be every seat in Scotland except one, the Lib Dems on 10, which was a dramatic drop from before, Plaid on 4, which would have seen them gaining a seat, and UKIP and the Greens on 2 each, with others on 19, which, as you could guess, Northern Irish parties. What was perhaps the most different about this coverage of this election is that there was a greater emphasis on the individual seats that came under the exit poll, likely as a result of this new methodology change, and the fact that the vast majority of the seats changing hands in the election were not necessarily seats between the Tories and Labour. Furthermore, given how shocking a lot of aspects of the exit poll were, especially with the SNP and the Lib Dem figures, it shouldn't be too surprising that the exit poll came under quite a fair bit of caution during the election coverage, especially by the Lib Dems, who I imagine were probably hoping to feel a bit more optimistic when the actual results came out. Perhaps most famously during the coverage, former Lib Dem leader Paddy Ashdown, when interviewed by Andrew Neil, said that he would eat his hat if the exit poll was correct, whilst former Labour strategist Alistair Campbell joined in by saying he would eat his kilt if Labour did as badly as the exit poll predicted. Ultimately, it's fair to say that both men were forced to eat humble pie, or rather, humble hat and kilt, I guess, respectively, and quite literally, so, you know, I'll give them credit for that. But this is especially because the overall figures for Labour and the Lib Dems were, as once again, quite accurate. In fact, actually, they were even worse than what the exit poll predicted they were going to be, with Labour getting 232 seats and the Lib Dems only getting 8, which is a miserable result for them. Who had slightly a less miserable night, if we're being honest, was the SNP, who actually did get their landslide victory in Scotland, although at 56 rather than 58, as the exit poll said. But I mean, come on, I don't think the SNP was going to be complaining with that figure anytime soon. However, the one party that the exit poll got completely wrong was actually the Conservative figure. Despite the exit poll predicting the Tories falling just short of getting a majority, much like with 5 years prior, which actually did materialise, the small inaccuracies in a lot of the other parties stacked up in the Tories' favour, which managed to just sneak them over the line, granting them a small majority of 331, widely against all expectations. Where the exit poll got it wrong, though, for the Tories was with a lot of the Conservative to Labour switching seats. There was a large expectation that Labour would take a lot of Conservative-held seats, enough that the Tories gaining seats from the collapse of the Lib Dems would not be enough for them to get over that 326 line. And looking at the strict Conservative to Labour switching seats, Labour in reality only made 2 extra out of it, gaining these 10 from the Tories, but also losing these 8 back. And looking at the individual seat battle board, we can sort of see where the exit poll went wrong. Looking at the BBC's election coverage battle board, we can see that it predicted Labour picking up a number of the most marginal, at the time, Conservative seats. But you can see that even looking at the first column of what was at the time the Tories' most marginal seats, you can see what went wrong here. Looking at even just the first 4, North Warwickshire, Thurrock, Hendon and Cardiff North, these were the most marginal, and yet the Tories held all of them despite what the exit poll suggested. I mean, granted, Labour did pick up a few that the exit poll got wrong, mainly within London, such as with Brentford and Isleworth, Enfield North, Ilford North or Ealing Central and Acton, but the inaccuracies heavily favoured the Tories. Also, it's also worth mentioning that the second seat for both the Greens and UKIP didn't manifest. In the Greens' case, this actually would have been Norwich South, not Bristol West, as I've heard quite a few times. Norwich South at the time was a Lib Dem seat, and whilst the Lib Dems did lose Norwich South, they actually lost it to Labour, not the Greens in the end. As for UKIP, I'm not 100% sure what this seat was, but my guess probably would have been Rochester and Stroud, which was UKIP at the time, after the sitting MP there had defected and then called a by-election, which he won as a UKIP candidate. So the Tories retook that, which is not something they were able to do in Clacton, leaving that as UKIP's only 2015 seat in the end. So overall, lots to look at in the 2015 exit poll. Most of the broader stories were correct, such as the SNP's landslide and the Lib Dems collapse, but it crucially failed to predict the Tories' majority because of a number of individual seat inaccuracies, which was against a lot of expectations. And speaking of being against expectations, we fast forward to 2 years in the future, where the exit poll this time was the one doing it. The 2017 election. This fucking brings back memories. So the background of the 2017 election was fairly simple. It wasn't, if we're being honest, but let's just simplify this for the time being. Theresa May, then the Prime Minister, which feels like ages ago, had a small majority off the back of what was on the 2015 election, but wanted a much larger and more personal one in order to push forward with Brexit negotiations following the referendum result for the UK to leave the EU a year prior. Who could forget that? And to be honest, almost every opinion poll leading up to her calling the general election showed that she'd get exactly that. A comfortable majority, whilst Labour were probably expecting a terrible result. Right up until our good friend the exit poll decided to completely throw expectations out the window by crushing May's dreams instead of granting them. 2017's exit poll had 314 for the Tories, which was 12 short of the majority, Labour on 266, the SNP on 34, the Lib Dems on 14, Plaid on 3, the Greens on 1, UKIP on none, and others on 18. Northern Irish parties once again. Given the fact that the exit poll 2 years prior had failed to predict a Tory majority on what was much weaker opinion polling for them, you can imagine the immense scepticism that everyone had when seeing that Theresa May not only didn't increase her majority, but lost it altogether, according to the exit poll, with Labour, who were widely expected to receive their worst result ever, benefiting in the process. You can see this quite a bit in the coverage for the exit poll, mainly on the BBC, where many reporters and journalists were emphasising that the Tories could still get a majority, despite what the exit poll was saying. So even they weren't confident about the exit poll's findings, even though they helped create it in a sense. But to be honest, you can't really blame them, given what the exit poll was predicting was so far off what opinion polls and party expectations were for the election, and they had literally just failed to predict a Tory majority 2 years prior. So, you know, it is a fair analysis if we're being honest. But as results started to come through, it became a lot more apparent Tories were failing to take all the crucial seats that they needed to if they actually wanted a majority. And by this point it was becoming much more apparent that the exit poll, which everyone had a hard time believing at first for fairly justifiable reasons, it was about to become the greatest election profit ever, to say the least. Because as I'm sure most people know by now, the Tories did not get their majority, falling to 318 seats, 4 above what the exit poll predicted, but still not enough for that majority that was wanted, and certainly still down on what was achieved in 2015. That being said, when you look at a lot of the individual seats on the exit poll, there's quite a few Tory and Labour seats that the exit poll didn't actually correctly predict who would win them. Perhaps one of the more interesting errors of the exit poll was that the exit poll actually predicted quite a notable Tory increase of Labour in Wales, a number of seats that would actually eventually fall in the 2019 election, such as Clwyd South, Wrexham or Delyn, were all considered as Tory gains here, whilst Labour, despite taking off a lot of their Tories' most marginal seats in England, were not doing the same in Wales, with very marginal Tory seats such as Gower, Vale of Clwyd and Cardiff North were predicted to stay with the Tories. Well, this was completely wrong, as not only did the Tories not gain a single Welsh seat off Labour, but they actually lost those 3 aforementioned seats that I mentioned. The Tories did gain a few seats off Labour in the end, gaining 6 seats off Labour in Northern England, sort of the starting of the collapse of the Red Wall, to put it in certain terms, including 1 seat in Copeland, which Labour had lost in a by-election 2 months prior. Similarly, although the total Lib Dem figure was largely accurate, reality only being 12 seats rather than 14, which, you know, is fair enough to the exit poll, but the actual individual seats themselves were not. The exit poll predicted the Lib Dems to gain 6 seats, all from the SNP in Scotland, in addition to keeping the 8 that they already had in 2015, which, as you could expect, because 2015 was an extremely low point for the Lib Dems. But in reality, the Lib Dems only gained 3 seats from the SNP in Scotland. As for the 3 they didn't, North East 5 was only 2 votes away, so, you know, benefit of the doubt there. Ruskye and Lochaber, which was Charles Kennedy's old seat, the Lib Dems came quite a distant third. And for one which the exit poll got completely wrong, there's Gordon, where the Lib Dems came dead last. Wasn't all bad for the Lib Dems though, as they gained 5 seats off the Tories, something that the exit poll failed to predict. But in return for this, they also lost 4 of their already fairly low 2015 base to other parties. This was Southport, which was lost to the Tories, Leeds North West and Sheffield Hallam were lost to Labour, the latter of which being when Nick Clegg lost his seat, and Cardigan was lost to Plaid in Wales, which also explains why Plaid has an extra seat in reality that the exit poll failed to predict. So if we're being honest, any of these inaccuracies probably could have actually given the Tories a majority. Probably still a smaller one, and probably still smaller than what was in 2015. But overall, we've got to say the exit poll got it right, and opinion polls at the time got it wrong, to the fortune of Labour. That being said, it's safe to say that Labour's fortunes were about to run out come the next election. 2019 was an interesting year in politics, to be honest. From Change UK, remember them, making headlines, to opinion polls showing a 4-way tie between the Tories, Labour, the Lib Dems and the Brexit Party at the time of EU elections that were not even supposed to happen. So, what happened in the general election? Was it as wacky as the rest of the year? Not quite, but that's not to say that the election didn't have some interesting projections, to say the least. 2019's exit poll had the Conservatives on 368, a very solid majority. Labour on 191, which would have been their worst performance since 1935. The SNP on 55, rivaling roughly what they got in their superb 2015 performance. The Lib Dems on 13, which was just up a seat. Plaid on 3, down a seat. The Greens on 1. Brexit Party didn't win anything. And the others on 19, again, Northern Irish parties. So, unlike in 2017, there was no upset this time around. The exit poll predicted a solid Tory majority and Labour suffering their worst defeat, which is essentially what was predicted to happen in 2017 had the polls been correct there. But this time, the polls actually were correct, and the exit poll very much echoed this. During the 2019 election coverage, it didn't really take very long to find out that the exit poll was reliable once again. Probably this was best shown when the Tories took Blythe Valley in Northumberland, a very long-standing Labour seat that, by a slender majority, it had voted Conservative for the first time ever in the election. Despite the shock that was caused from the seat turning blue, it was something that the exit poll had actually correctly predicted. And unlike in both 2015 and 2017, the exit poll was basically spot on for predicting which seats the Tories would take off Labour, potentially helped by the greater swing between the two parties than the 2 previous elections. Obviously, not every seat was perfectly predicted. Like, there were a few Tory-Labour switching seats that the exit poll did not get correct. But most of the inaccuracies actually came down to the Lib Dems' individual seats, much like in 2017, as the exit poll had them winning a few seats that they eventually didn't. But otherwise, once again, the exit poll was basically spot on in almost every regard. The Tories got 365 seats in the end, 3 down from what the exit poll said. Labour got 202, about 11 seats up from what they expected. The Lib Dems got 11 in reality, which was 1 seat less than what they had beforehand, rather than 1 more than what they thought they had. Plaid didn't actually lose a seat in the end, and then, yeah, the Greens, Brexit Party, and the others, that was all the same. So, yeah, fairly decent track record, all things considered, from the exit poll. So, what role will the exit poll play for the next election? Well, there's 2 similarities with the 2019 election, which gives the exit poll more leeway. Firstly, the election is not expected to be close. One of the 2 main parties is firmly ahead of the other, and despite how optimistic some Tories are thinking, this is unlikely to change drastically in time for the next election. Obviously, difference being this time that it's Labour who's ahead this time, not the Conservatives, but the principle still stands. And secondly, the swing from Conservative to Labour is expected to be massive, potentially one of the largest swings in election history, which means, much like in 2019, most seats that flip will be going in one direction and not both, unlike, say, in 2015 and even to a lesser extent 2017. So obviously, it's unlikely that the exit poll will once again be able to predict each seat precisely again, despite a lot of groundbreaking advances in psephology since the 2019 election, but you can imagine that the overall numbers for the parties are likely to at least predict the overall outcome unless a massive upset happens. But the exit poll has been very good at predicting upsets at this point, so if there is going to be an upset, it probably won't be the exit poll's fault. So to conclude this piece of mine, I think it's safe to say that the exit poll is very unique in what it carries out and has become a staple of UK election coverage at this point. Since screwing it up massively in its debut election, it's since become an accurate source of what to expect in a general election, probably even more so than opinion polling at the time. And as psephology gets more studied and predictions become more detailed, I imagine the exit poll will continue to be a staple tool for elections to come, including this coming election.